They found the bodies face down in the dungeon, wrists snapped backward, teeth shattered from biting down on their own screams. These were noblemen, courtiers, generals, broken not by war, but by one man, Ferdinand VII of Spain. A king so obsessed with loyalty, he stripped flesh from those he called friends. His private tortures were not whispered rumors, but public practices conducted in secret chambers beneath the Palacio Real. Iron masks that sealed the face for days, boots laced with coals until the toes roasted. He didn't just punish treason, he created it. Imagine being summoned by your king, only to vanish, your name erased, your lineage dissolved. This wasn't medieval savagery. This was the 19th century. Napoleon had just been defeated. Spain was supposed to be free, but in the shadows of victory, Ferdinand returned not as a liberator, but as a nightmare in a crown. He had promised restoration, peace, a return to order. Instead, the liberals who had fought for the Cortes were hunted like animals. Daylight arrests turned to midnight disappearances. Citizens were dragged from beds, accused of thought crimes before the phrase even existed. And in the dungeons, Ferdinand watched. He watched as fingernails bled under clamps, as bodies writhed on the rack. He didn't avert his eyes because this was his theater, a place where he was both ruler and God. No judge, no trial, just the king's decree. Some screamed for mercy, others broke into laughter before going silent forever. Spain tasted freedom for seconds. Then, it was yanked away just long enough to remember what it felt like. That was the cruelty, not just the pain, but the knowing that the monster who prowled the catacombs wasn't hiding his face. He wore a crown. Years earlier, in 1808, he was exiled to France by Napoleon, a powerless prince with no future. But even then, he begged Napoleon to restore him, to make him king again. Letters spilled with desperation, masked as loyalty. When the Peninsular War ended and the people welcomed him back, they expected gratitude, reform, a king reborn by hardship. But there had been no transformation, only festering. Ferdinand returned not humbled, but hungrier. He tore up the 1812 Constitution, arrested the deputies who wrote it, and declared absolute power under divine right. Priests blessed it, generals enforced it, and anyone who hesitated disappeared. What France's chains couldn't do, the Spanish people did willingly. They invited their tyrant home, and he repaid them with a reign so suffocating, Spain seemed to forget what liberty sounded like. Each day, the silence grew thicker, and deep beneath Madrid, the moans echoed louder. But what twisted a child of royalty into this monstrous sovereign? Some point to his father, Charles IV, a weak monarch manipulated by court favorites and foreign powers. Others blame the ceaseless betrayals Ferdinand endured, imprisoned between Napoleon's ambitions and his own court's treacheries. Yet none of this explains the pleasure he took in pain. Eyewitnesses recall how he smiled during interrogations, how his fingers would twitch when he heard a scream, a man who read confessionals like poems, tasting every line of desperation. In 1820, when a military uprising forced him to reinstate the constitution he'd trampled, he did not break, he bided. He kept his voice calm, his manners courtly, while inside, he plotted his revenge. When intervention came from France, Ferdinand unleashed purges so brutal church bells tolled not for weddings or deaths, but for the next round of executions. Spain lived in dread, and dread was exactly what he desired. He invented torment like a composer, writes music. In his final years, Ferdinand crafted new methods of humiliation reserved not for spies or insurrectionists, but for those who once loved him. Daughters of nobles were forced into convents, then burned for sins no one spoke aloud. Priests were stripped of robes and dignity, and made to kneel for hours in cesspools beneath the palace walls. When a famine struck, he hoarded grain. When cholera spread, he fled, not to protect himself, but to watch from a distance, untouched by the rot. The people wailed in streets, mothers hollow-eyed from grief, and still he tightened his grip. Not even death ended his cruelty. His final decree named his daughter Isabella heir, igniting a civil war that bled Spain for decades. A nation crushed not by invaders, but by one of her own. And long after the echoes of screaming faded, The memory of Ferdinand's reign still haunts the earth he poisoned. But perhaps the most grotesque legacy of Ferdinand VII lies hidden not in documents, but in the lingering fear that draped across generations. Families changed their names to erase their lineage, villages refused to speak of certain relatives, and diaries, those private whispers of truth, were burned in silence. It wasn't just that he broke bodies, he shattered memory. The king had learned that torture was not merely physical, it was the permanent distortion of identity, the fogging of truth until reality bent to his will. Even his own portraits were retouched to erase rumors of disease, madness, and the cold inhumanity in his eyes. Today, tourists stroll the halls of the Royal Palace, unaware of what the stone once echoed. But the air remembers. Beneath the marble and gold, something lingers. Not ghosts, no, something worse. The legacy of a man who did not reign to govern, but to consume, to defile hope, and to make sure Spain never breathed without his permission again. And yet, for all the horror he inflicted, Ferdinand VII died not by revolution or blade, but quietly, in his bed. No crowd gathered to curse his name, no statue toppled. His death passed like a shadow across the land, dreaded but unspoken. Those he terrorized dared not cheer. The silence was too deep, too dangerous. Even in death, his grip remained. Ministers continued his policies in whispers. His daughter fought to maintain his vision. Generations felt his absence not as relief, but as a cold echo of control. In the pages of history, he fades behind names more infamous, but ask the elders in the countryside, the ones who never rebuilt the family homes, who still look over their shoulders at dusk. To them, the name Ferdinand is not of a king, but of a ghost, a scourge. A reminder that sometimes it is not war or conquest that destroys a nation, but the twisted soul of the man trusted to protect it. Even now, his tomb lies undisturbed within El Escorial, polished and pristine, as though his sins were never carved in screams. Tour guides speak his name with neutrality, like a fading ink on parchment. But listen closely, behind the marble, behind the relics of royal grandeur. Do you hear it? The quiet scratching of history trying to claw its way back to the surface, the cries of those erased, called madmen or traitors, whose only crime was hope. Ferdinand VII did not just reign over Spain, he infected it, seeped into its rituals, its fears, its silences, and for all the impalements, the dismemberments, the trials where verdicts were etched in blood before words were spoken, his most enduring cruelty was erasure, not the absence of history, but the smothering of truth beneath official smiles. So ask yourself, when a crown rests on a head without mercy, what is left of dignity? What can possibly survive the memory of a man who ruled not with justice, but with delight in the sound of breaking men? Some say tyranny vanishes with time. That cruelty fades like smoke once the tyrant is gone. But Ferdinand VII was not smoke. He was oil slick, clinging, impossible to rinse from the soul of a nation. His rule did not die with him. It calcified, became custom, vanished into the machinery of state. Even reforms bore his fingerprints, policies shaped not by progress, but by reminders of terror. Writers censored themselves long after the censors were gone. Children were raised not just in fear, but in forgetting. This was his final act, to hollow out Spain's memory until justice felt alien and trust felt dangerous. He is not forgotten because he was insignificant. He is forgotten because remembering him means facing a mirror too cruel to bear. But look long enough, and the reflection returns, twisted, weeping, wearing a crown. Spain survived Ferdinand VII, but some would argue it never truly recovered. In the end, there is no monument tall enough to shadow what Ferdinand VII inflicted, no national anthem that can drown out centuries of silent trauma. He did not go down in flames, nor was he torn apart by revolution. Instead, he evaporated into the cracks of Spain's foundations. His reign didn't end, it metastasized, into institutions, into quiet glances of suspicion, into the nervous laughter of historians skimming past his chapter. He became a template for tyranny that needed no banners, only silence. And so his ghost lives, faceless and still, embedded in the bones of palaces, in the architecture of fear. We do not remember Ferdinand VII with anger or admiration. We recall him with unease, Because he teaches a truth more terrifying than war, that sometimes evil does not scream. Sometimes it smiles, wears silk, dines with bishops, and goes to its grave without a scratch. And worst of all, is never truly gone. History often remembers tyrants with fire, with riots, with revolutions, with defiant chants echoing through scorched capitals. But Ferdinand VII was different. He left behind no hurricane of rage, only a vacuum, a silence so profound it rewired a nation's soul. For decades, historians drew soft curtains around his atrocities, dressing them in terms like absolutism or reactionary rule, as if the language could soften the screams. But you cannot archive pain. You cannot footnote fear. His portrait may still hang in government galleries, his name etched politely among monarchs, but beneath the surface, the truth pulses. Ferdinand's reign was not a detour in history. It was a contamination, one that lingered in the ink of schoolbooks, in the hesitations of a grandmother's tales, in the unconsecrated graves deep in forest shadows. So next time you trace your fingers along the stones of Spanish cathedrals, or walk the manicured halls of Madrid's elite, that chill crawling up your spine. That's not the past, that's what he left behind. And so, the question lingers not in textbooks or official chronicles, but in the quiet dread that clings to corridors untouched by time. How does a nation unlearn fear taught over generations? Ferdinand VII was not just a man, he was a method, a poison that entered Spain through law, through religion, through the very rhythm of tradition. He broke Spain without shattering it, kept it whole so its suffering would look civilized. And now, centuries later, we repeat his patterns without uttering his name. We silence rebels with bureaucracy. We deny pain with polite language. Perhaps that's how the worst legacies survive, not through celebration, but through systemic forgetfulness. Statues fall, dictators die, but their echoes hide in harmless places, in hymns, in uniforms, in courtrooms, and unless we name them for what they are, unless we dig through the silence, the cycle begins again, not in fire, but in a whisper, just like Ferdinand intended. The tragedy of Ferdinand VII is not just that he lived, but that his shadow still lingers, imperceptible yet omnipresent, in every act of doubt toward democratic ideals, in every whispered suspicion of reform. His breath hovers. The arcane rituals he enforced, the punishments he inspired, metastasized into cultural reflexes. Spain did not bury its tyrant, it absorbed him. His methods mutated, lost their names, but not their purpose. And when a teacher hesitates to teach certain chapters, when a child is taught pride without context, when a leader is praised for strength without compassion, he is there, watching through the veil of time. Not as a king, not as a ghost, but as a pattern yearning to repeat. That is his final cruelty, that we think we have moved on, that when silence falls over injustice, we call it peace. But Spain knows better. It has lived under a smile sharp enough to bleed, and too many still mistake the blade for a blessing. So now, as you stand beneath the painted ceilings of royal chapels or read dry plaques beside velvet portraits, ask yourself, what stories are still missing? Who were the silenced, the extinguished, the erased? History does not forget because it can't remember. It forgets because someone chose to silence the memory. Ferdinand VII did not carve his legacy in stone, but in the absences between names, in the empty seats of parliaments, in the blank spaces of censored books. To understand him is not to recount his reign, but to feel the void he imposed, the hesitations he left behind. And perhaps this is the deepest horror, not the screams we still remember, but the ones we never got to hear. Voices buried before they were spoken, futures smothered before they had names. In a world rushing to forget, remembering becomes rebellion. And in that rebellion, a whisper, quiet but defiant Ferdinand, cannot rest. Because in that defiant whisper lies the one thing Ferdinand VII could never fully crush: truth. Not the official kind, trimmed and gilded for textbooks, but the raw, bleeding truth carried silently through generations. The truth spoken in lullabies that warn children not to cry too loud, in glances exchanged between elders when someone spoke too openly. It survives in rituals without explanations, in customs shaped by caution, in fears too old to name. and though time may try to soften it, to polish the horror with accolades and footnotes, the truth remains. A kingdom once bled from within, suffocated not by chains, but by the whim of a smile in power. Remembering Ferdinand VII does not offer closure. It opens a wound, a necessary one, because only by exposing the darkness can we ensure it does not return clothed in civility. And perhaps, just perhaps, by telling the story no one wants to remember, we make sure it is never repeated. So let the marble fade, let the portraits crack and the gilded scripts flake into dust, because memory, when denied, becomes rot. And Spain, like so many nations shaped by unseen violence, must one day decide whether to build atop buried suffering or to exhume it, face it, and name it. Ferdinand VII will never apologize. He left no confession, no remorse, but his victims, silent for centuries, still deserve their reckoning. And you, yes, you watching now carry the weight of knowing, of feeling what history tried to exhale in silence. That is the power no tyrant can steal, not monuments or laws, but memory sharpened into truth, a truth so cold, so naked, it cannot be wrapped in excuses. The crown did not make the man infected the crown, and long after bones decay and flags fade, the question will echo through every cathedral, every parliament, every voice brave enough to ask, who dares wear it next? Centuries from now, textbooks may list dates, treaties, and monarchs in tidy lines. They might mention Ferdinand VII in passing another ruler in a long chain of kings. But beneath the ink lies a different ledger, a quiet register kept not by scholars, but by those who carried the wounds generation after generation, etched not in words, but in reflexes, in hesitation, in silence. His cruelty is not just history, it is legacy. It hums in the gaps between questions never asked, in the traditions obeyed without understanding. To truly remember Ferdinand is not to count his victims or recount his crimes. It is to recognize the echo left in the structure of fear itself. And when we step into the stories we've ignored, when we dare to unearth what was buried beneath centuries of silence, we do more than remember. We reclaim. We declare that even the cruelest echoes can be broken. Even the most suffocating shadows can be named. That horror endured is not horror owned, not anymore. So when the stone walls crumble and the monuments to forgotten monarchs turn to sand, let the wind carry what matters, not the names of kings, but the lessons burned into silence. Ferdinand VII may disappear beneath bureaucracy and time-worn ritual, his crimes diluted in the ink of sanitized histories. But beneath every repressive silence, every law that turns dissent into danger, his ghost stirs. He was not a chapter, he was a warning. And now you have heard his story not just with ears, but with the part of yourself that still flinches at injustice cloaked in order. That unease you feel, that is history doing its work, refusing to be buried, refusing to be tamed. Let it grow, let it question, let it shatter the palaces of denial, because if Ferdinand VII taught the world anything, it is that forgetting is the tyrant's favorite victory, and remembering is our only defense. So let this not end as merely spectacle or tale. Let it carve itself where it matters most, behind your eyes, in the stillness of your thoughts, where silence can no longer hide tyrants. Ferdinand VII is gone, but the machinery he loved, the silence he weaponized, lingers. And now that you have seen it, truly seen it for what it is, you hold something that can't be taken: awareness. A thread of unbroken memory in defiance of royal erasure. It will not make the past less cruel, but it may keep tomorrow from echoing blindly. Let his name, once whispered in dread, echo now in warning. A mark not of reverence, but of resistance. The forgotten torture is no longer forgotten. It has been spoken, remembered, and shared. And in that act, in the simple, stubborn refusal to let silence win, you have done what tyrants fear most. You have listened. You have remembered. And in that, he loses. And so let this not be the end, but the beginning of a deeper reckoning. Ferdinand VII may rest in stone, but the stories he silenced still breathe in broken bloodlines and in the unrecorded footnotes of countless lives. His was not merely a reign, but a rupture, one that split Spain's soul into the before and the after. Now, you inhabit the after. And as with all histories born of pain, what you do with this knowledge shapes more than memory. It shapes the future. Because every tyrant begins with denial, and every resistance begins with truth. The legacy of cruelty is not just chains and blood, it is the ceaseless whisper that justice demands forgetting. But you do not have to listen. Let Ferdinand VII be remembered not for the silence he commanded, but for the voices his brutality could not extinguish. And let each new voice rise, louder than the last, until the echoes of the tortured finally drown the silence that tried to erase them. Some legacies are written in ink, others are carved into flesh, but Ferdinand VII etched his into the marrow of a nation, into the muscle memory of fear, into the breath held between generations. His cruelty is not just remembered, it is rehearsed, often unconsciously, in the rituals of silence that still haunt institutions. He has no shrine, no candlelit vigil, yet his presence lingers where repression breathes easiest. In forgotten prisons, revised curricula, polite forgetfulness. Today we tell his story not to immortalize him, but to unmask him, a relic not of grandeur, but of rot. And though he cannot be tried, though his bones lie undisturbed, our remembering is an act of justice, a reckoning disguised as remembrance. Because truth, once spoken, does not bow to crowns, and when memory rises from the depths of forgotten screams, it does more than illuminate the past, it limits the future. This is not closure. This is a beginning carved in resistance and in the names that will no longer be silenced. Remember this: tyrants like Ferdinand VII don't vanish with death, they wait, in silence, in laws not questioned, in stories not told. They thrive when eyes glance away from truth, when nations prefer pride over pain. But history can be louder than silence, if we choose to speak it, to name what was buried, to honor the erased. His torture chambers may be dust, his decrees ink on brittle parchment, but the terror he sowed still stalks vulnerable hearts. And now, with these words, with this story carved through bone and breath, the forgetting ends. Not because a king deserves remembrance, but because his victims deserve more: light, voice, justice. And as long as one voice remains to speak their names, to recall the screams the crown tried to smother, then Ferdinand VII does not get the final word. We do, and our word is memory, not as a burden, but as a torch, one bright enough to burn through even royal shadows. This is where the story ends, yet also where it must continue, not through the halls of power nor the mouths of kings, but in the quiet resilience of memory kept alive by those who refuse to let the vile be buried beneath velvet. The torture of Ferdinand VII was never just about shackles or scars. It was about severing a nation's voice at the root. And if that voice now rises, however cracked or trembling, it is the defiance he feared most. Because in truth, every echo of justice, every whisper from beneath the weight of history, is a reclamation of power, of grief, of truth. So remember him not as a sovereign, but as a scar, not in glory, but in warning. And may that warning never fade, never be softened, never be silenced again. The forgotten torture is no longer forgotten. It lives now, wherever truth is finally told and silence, at last, is broken. So let Ferdinand VII stand not in the shadows of history, but in its harshest light, not for admiration, but as a mirror held to every age that courts repression beneath civility. His legacy was not just cruelty, it was the normalization of it. Brutality masked by ceremony, tyranny wrapped in tradition. And now, as we close this chapter, let it not seal behind us like a tombstone. Let it remain open, raw, unsettling. Because the torture he wrought was not a relic, it was a blueprint. Remembering him is not about mourning the past, it is about warning the present. Spain wept in silence for generations because one man taught it the price of speaking. Let us honor that silence by ending it. Let us inscribe his name not in marble, but in vigilance. The torture of Ferdinand VII is no longer forgotten. It has been dragged into the light, and in that light, it cannot reign again. Let his cruelty be studied not to marvel, but to guard. Let schoolrooms speak what was once stifled, and let his name evoke not reverence, but caution. Because Ferdinand VII was not an aberration, he was a culmination of fear tolerated, of silence rewarded, of power unbound. And though his story ends in still tombs and hushed corridors, its echoes warn us still. When loyalty is demanded at the cost of truth, when obedience is revered above justice, when rulers command reverence but shun accountability, we must remember him, not to give him life, but to deny him return. The story of Spain's most perverted king is not just about him, but about us, about what we allow, what we forget, and what we dare to confront. So let his crown rot quietly beneath stone. Let his mask of civility crumble, and let us, finally, rise as keepers of memory, not out of vengeance, but so no tyrant may ever again reign in such shadows unchecked. For centuries his name slid into the footnotes, a flicker between monarchs more dramatized for romantic failures or military blunders, but none bore a cruelty so intimate, so methodical, as Ferdinand VII. His reign teaches that evil rarely arrives unannounced. It whispers first, promising safety. It kneels before it conquers, and when it rules, it does so not with the roar of tyranny, but the rustle of curtains drawn in secrecy. We end this story not to close it, but to leave it ajar so the warnings may breathe. For every generation that wakes in peace owes a silent debt to those who once screamed into the darkness. Let Ferdinand's name linger, not in power, but in purpose. Let the memory of his victims rise where his legacy tried to crush them, and let every echo spoken in defiance remind us that silence, though favored by kings, belongs never to justice, only to forgetting. So this is the final breath of his legacy, drifting into the listener's ear like a solemn vow. Ferdinand VII will not rise again, not as flesh, not as monarch, but as silence, if we let it reign. Let every school that dares to omit his name feel the weight of omission. Let every archive that shelves away the cries of the vanished quake with the knowledge that history, when silenced, becomes conspiracy. This script ends, but the reckoning does not. Remember him not to repeat him, but to rewrite the space he once poisoned. Carry forward the names that were never spoken, the children never born, the voices stilled in stone. In that carrying, we undo a fragment of his curse. What he stole in secrecy, give back in truth. Let memory rise not as mourning, but as resistance, and let the world know Ferdinand VII is no longer forgotten. He is exposed, forever. So if this story has anchored anywhere, let it be in the mind that doubts silence, that questions sanitized tradition, that sees not just glory but what it concealed. Ferdinand VII reigned long ago, yet his legacy threads through every unchecked authority, every forgotten victim, every obedient hush that follows inherited power. He was not a moment, he was a mechanism. And now, with truth laid bare and memory dragging itself from centuries of shadow, we close this tale not to heal, but to remember with clarity. Let no gilded tale of Spain ignore the cost paid in tortured voices. Let no ruler wear a crown unchallenged, unchecked, because memory, when brave, is shield, sword, and torch. And though Ferdinand's name may fade from official lines, let it burn in the conscience of those who now know. That crown will never be clean, that silence will never be safe, and that story will never again go untold. Because in the end, stories like these do not end, they reverberate, in civic apathy, in forgotten laws, in the quiet tolerance of injustice disguised as order. Ferdinand VII does not haunt with chains or cells anymore. He haunts with hesitation, with that split-second fear before speaking truth, with the freezing pause in classrooms before uttering uncomfortable facts. His reign survives not in palaces, but in patterns, and the only way to break them is to remember, sharply, unflinchingly, to grab history not as ornament, but as accountability. Let his name rot where it belongs in the pit of warnings passed between those who will not look away. And so, if you carry anything from this tale, carry this. The silence that once protected tyranny is cracking. You are part of that fracture. Use your voice, sharpen your memory. And wherever power cloaks itself in piety and tradition, remember the screams beneath the crown. Speak them, loudly. That is how we end it, completely. And so, let this be where silence ends for good, where memory, unburdened by fear, becomes an act of resistance all its own. Ferdinand VII's cruelty does not remain in chains or blood-stained floors, but in how history dares to speak, or shrinks behind euphemism. Let us strip away the language that softened his crimes. Let us call them what they were. Terror under a crown, perversion of power. We do not summon his name to honor it, we summon it so no tyrant can wear the mask of civility again. This story, once buried by velvet and time, has risen, not just to remember an ordeal, but to ensure it is never repeated. Spain's agony under Ferdinand VII is not forgotten. It has been named, it has been heard, and now it lives on not in fear, but in fire. Let that fire guard the doors of power forevermore. Let that fire be the final word. Let that fire burn in the pages of every book brave enough to tell the truth. Let it flicker in classrooms where silence once ruled, in town squares where monuments once lied, and in hearts that refuse to let history be rewritten by omission. Ferdinand VII is no longer just a name from a forgotten chapter. He is the reason we question, the warning carved into the marrow of remembrance. So let this moment be sacred not for him, but for them, for those devoured by a kingdom that wore piety like armor and cruelty like perfume. Light a candle not for the king, but for the voices he tried to erase, and promise them this, that their pain will remain unhidden, that their memory will not fade into comfort. Spain does not belong to tyrants past or present. It belongs to the truth, and that truth, fierce, painful, and unyielding, will outlast every crown ever dared to silence it. So let the fire stay lit, not as vengeance, but as vigilance. Let it pass from generation to generation, not as bitterness, but as a reminder. Silence is never neutral. Ferdinand VII ruled by making truth his enemy. But today, we speak it. We lift the veil, not to curse the past, but to guard the future. This is the final breath of his dominion, replaced by memory, by names no longer swallowed by darkness. The forgotten torture, the erased voices, the pain buried in palatial walls, they live again in truth. And in that truth lies power. If history dares to blur his cruelty, let our clarity sharpen it. If monuments aim to cleanse, let our stories stain. Let Spain not walk blind into tomorrow, but with eyes wide open, guided by the cries it once silenced. This is not just remembrance, this is resistance, this is reckoning, and in that reckoning his throne is dust, his silence undone. Let it be written not in gold leaf, not in regal script, but in ash and scar that Spain remembers, that every whisper once stolen has returned, louder than ever, etched into the bones of its archives, its plazas, its people. The forgotten torture of Ferdinand VII is no longer a footnote. It is a flame, a reckoning told not from thrones, but from the ground up, from the broken hearts of survivors history overlooked. This is not a tale of endings, but of awakenings. So let the silence stay broken. Let every church bell echo the names once banned. Let every lesson dare to name the wound. And when power next wears the mask of piety, let those who heard this story stand ready not just to remember, but to resist. Because now, the truth burns too brightly to be hidden again. Ferdinand VII is exposed, and in that light, Spain breathes freely.